as I staggered into the clearing, my legs finally gave out and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The figure moved toward me, and as they stepped into the moonlight, I saw it was another ranger. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The other ranger knelt beside me, concern etched on his face. "Jake, what the hell happened? We've been looking for you all night. I've spent more nights in Randolph Forest than I can count, each one blending into the next. The towering trees, crunch of leaves beneath my boots, and the distant calls of owls have become my companions in this remote stretch of wilderness. But tonight something feels different. Off, in a way I can't quite explain." I started my shift like any other, making my rounds, checking the trails. The air was still, too still, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted, almost as if the woods were holding their breath. As I walked deeper into the shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't unusual to feel eyes on me out here. Wildlife was always curious. This was different. It was as if the trees themselves were observing me, their branches twisting and curling in the dim light like skeletal fingers reaching out. Then the radio crackled to life, startling me. Dara, my partner, was on the other end, her voice strained, almost panicked. She was near the old cabin, that abandoned relic of a bygone era deep in the forest, and she was seeing things. Shadowy figures moving between the trees, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Sarah's tough, not one to scare easily, so hearing the fear in her voice set my nerves on edge. I picked up my pace, heading towards the cabin, my heart thudding in my chest. The path felt unfamiliar. Though I'd walked it 100 times, it twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, like the forest itself was shifting around me. Every step seemed to echo too loudly in the silence, and the air grew colder, biting at my skin despite the layers I had on. As I got closer, the unease in my gut turned into something sharper, something close to dread. Trees loomed overhead, their branches tangling together like a dark canopy, blocking out the moonlight. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, my breath caught. The door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze, and there was no sign of Sarah. I called out for her, my voice sounding small and fragile in the heavy air. Only the wind answered. I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. An overpowering stench of decay, mixed with something else, something I couldn't place but that made my stomach churn. The cabin was a mess. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered everywhere like someone or something had been searching for something in a hurry. My flashlight beam swept across the room, catching shadows that seemed to dart out of sight just as I turned towards them. My heart raced, and I gripped the flashlight tighter, feeling the cold sweat trickling down my spine. Then I heard it, the whispers Sarah had mentioned. Faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent, like 1,000 voices murmuring just beyond the edge of understanding. I couldn't make out any words, just a steady, rhythmic chant that set every nerve in my body on edge. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to pinpoint the source of the whispers. They seemed to be everywhere, filling the room and pressing in on me from all sides. I forced myself to stay calm, focus, but it felt like the cabin was closing in, the walls warping and shifting in the dim light. I moved cautiously through the room, trying to push back the rising panic. The papers scattered on the floor caught my eye. Some old, yellowed with age, others newer, torn and crumpled. I knelt down to look closer, my flashlight flickering as I did. The writing was erratic, scrawled in a shaky hand, but I could make out fragments. Words like shadows, lost, and trapped jumped out at me, sending a chill down my spine. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I felt a rush of cold air sweep through the cabin, extinguishing my flashlight. Panic surged as I was plunged into darkness, only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the dirty windows. I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to turn back on, but it was no use. The whispers were getting closer, more distinct, as if whatever was making them was just behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around, but the darkness was impenetrable. I could barely see my hand in front of my face. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I felt the walls closing in, the whispers now a cacophony in my ears. I stumbled backward, tripping over something on the floor, and crashed into a table, knocking it over with a loud bang. The noise seemed to trigger something. a sudden, intense pressure in the air, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, my mind spinning with terror. I had to get out of that cabin. Now. The whispers were louder than ever, swirling around me, their words unintelligible but filled with a malevolent intent. It felt like they were pushing me, urging me to run, flee from whatever was closing in. I lunged toward the door, but the darkness seemed to have thickened, like it was alive, wrapping around me and pulling me back. My fingers fumbled for the doorknob, finally finding it and yanking the door open. The cold night air hit me like a shock, but it was a relief. At least out there, I could see the moonlight filtering through the trees. I burst out of the cabin, nearly tripping on the uneven ground as I stumbled into the forest. The whispers followed me, but they were fainter now, like the trees were swallowing them up. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away from that place. But as I ran, the forest seemed to twist and change around me. The path I'd taken to get here was gone, replaced by dense underbrush and towering trees that all looked the same. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning as I pushed forward, desperate to find my way back to safety. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, my eyes darting around to catch any movement. I knew I wasn't alone out here, that whatever was in the cabin was still following me, watching me. I could feel its presence, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw it. Faint light in the distance. My heart leaped with hope as I pushed myself toward it, the branches clawing at my clothes as I stumbled through the underbrush. The light grew brighter, and I could make out a figure standing in the clearing, their silhouette barely visible against the trees. Tried to speak. The words caught in my throat. The memory of the cabin, the whispers, those pale faces, they all rushed back, overwhelming me. I could only manage to shake my head, still too shaken to make sense of it all. "We need to get out of here," I finally croaked, my voice trembling. "Something's out there, something not right." He helped me to my feet, and I leaned heavily on him as we made our way back through the forest. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. The ranger's steady presence kept me grounded. The whispers had faded. The unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. As we reached the main trail, first light of dawn was beginning to break through the trees. Forest, which had felt so menacing just moments before, now seemed almost peaceful in the early morning light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever was out there was still lurking in the shadows, waiting. When we finally reached the ranger station, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and disbelief. The other rangers gathered around, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what had happened. How could I? How could I make them understand what I'd seen, what I'd felt? They tried to get me to talk, to recount the night's events, but I just shook my head. "It's over," I muttered, more to myself than to them. "The forest, it's not safe. Not at night." The ranger who'd found me exchanged a worried glance with the others. I knew they didn't believe me, not fully. They would write it off as exhaustion, maybe even a hallucination brought on by stress. But I knew the truth. The whispers of Randolph Forest were real. Something ancient, something dark, still lingered out there, just beyond the reach of the morning light. And as I finally sat down, trying to steady my frayed nerves, I knew that I'd never set foot in that forest again. Some things are better left undisturbed, and some places were never meant to be explored. My name's Harry, and I've spent the last decade as a ranger in Randolph Forest. It's the kind of place that can take your breath away with its beauty, towering pines, winding streams, kind of solitude that sinks deep into your bones. But there's more to this forest than meets the eye. Over the years, I've learned to respect the whispers that drift through the trees, the secrets that seem to lurk just out of sight. Randolph Forest isn't just another patch of wilderness. It's a place where you feel watched, even when you're sure you're alone. Some days, the forest feels alive, almost as if it's breathing, with shadows that stretch a little too long and sounds that don't quite match the natural order of things. I've had my share of strange encounters, but I've always chalked them up to the tricks of the mind. Until that one autumn evening. The eastern edge of the forest has always given me the creeps. It's dense, with a canopy that blocks out most of the light, even on the brightest days. The locals avoid it, and even the wildlife seems to keep its distance. I never had a reason to venture there often, but when the call came in about a missing hiker named Sarah, I knew I had to go. That's my job, after all, keeping people safe, even when the forest seems determined to do otherwise. It was late afternoon when the call came through, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, telling me that a hiker named Sarah was missing near the eastern edge. I felt that familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my gut. I'd heard stories about that area, nothing concrete, just old ranger tales and whispered rumors, but enough to make me uneasy. I grabbed my gear and headed out, trying to push the uneasy thoughts aside. The trail was rough, winding through thick underbrush, and the further I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt path and the steady thud of my heartbeat in my ears. As I walked, that sense of foreboding I'd felt earlier grew stronger. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches almost touching overhead, blocking out the fading light. The air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, even though the sky had been clear when I'd started. I kept my eyes on the trail, but every so often, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, just the wind, I told myself, or maybe a deer. When I finally reached the coordinates Sarah had last transmitted, the light was nearly gone, and the forest was bathed in that strange, gray twilight comes just before nightfall. Her backpack was there, lying on the ground, with its contents scattered as if she'd dropped it in a hurry. A flashlight, a water bottle, a map, all tossed carelessly, like she'd been running from something. My chest tightened with worry as I called out her name, but the only response was the echo of my own voice and the distant cry of a bird, startled from its roost. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. I knew I had to keep moving, but with every step, the sense that something was watching me grew stronger. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And in that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had spooked Sarah was still out there, lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam. I stood there for a moment, staring at Sarah's scattered belongings, trying to make sense of it all. My breath hung in the cold air as I bent down to pick up her flashlight. The ground was damp, the smell of earth and leaves thick in my nose, but underneath it, I caught a whiff of something else. Something faint, but unmistakable. Decay. It was the kind of smell that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I kept calling out her name as I scanned the area, but there was no response, just the oppressive silence pressing in on me from all sides. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was quickly plunging into darkness. I switched on Sarah's flashlight, grateful for the extra light, and started following a faint trail that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The deeper I went, colder it got. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones, making you shiver even when you're bundled up. Every sound seemed amplified. Crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of a twig in the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was moving in the shadows, just beyond my vision. I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. That smell of decay grew stronger the further I went, and my stomach churned with a mix of fear and dread. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard it. Faint, high-pitched cry, drifting through the trees. Didn't sound like Sarah. It sounded like a child, desperate and pleading. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't leave without at least checking it out. I pushed through the underbrush, the sound growing louder, more urgent. The forest seemed to close in around me, the branches snagging at my clothes, trying to hold me back. And then I saw it. A small, dilapidated shack, barely visible in the darkness. Its walls were weathered and cracked, the windows shattered like jagged teeth. The cries were coming from inside, echoing out into the night. My heart raced as I approached, every step feeling heavier than the last. I stood at the entrance, my hand trembling as I reached for the door, creaked open slowly, the sound piercing the silence like a scream. Inside, the air was thick and musty, and the smell of decay was overpowering. My flashlight swept across the room, and that's when I saw her. Sarah, huddled in a corner, her body trembling with fear. I stepped inside the shack, floorboards creaking beneath my boots. The dim light from my flashlight flickered across the room, revealing broken furniture and debris scattered everywhere. Sarah was huddled in a corner, her eyes wide and darting around as if she could see something I couldn't. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and her breath came in ragged gasps. "Sarah!" I called out softly, trying to make my voice as calm as possible. She jumped at the sound, her head snapping towards me with a look of sheer panic. For a moment, she just stared, her eyes reflecting the light of my flashlight like two hollow voids. I took a few cautious steps forward, kneeling down to her level. "It's okay. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me what happened?" Sarah's eyes never left the shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Her voice came out in a frantic whisper, barely audible over the eerie silence of the shack. I heard a child crying. It was so real, so desperate. I followed the sound, thinking I could help, but then she broke off, her body trembling as she hugged her knees to her chest. Her gaze remained fixed on a dark corner of the room, her face pale with fear. They came out of nowhere. Figures in the shadows. They were whispering. I couldn't understand them. Felt like they were suffocating me with their presence. I could see the terror etched on her face, and it chilled me more than anything I'd encountered in the forest. I reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "It's all right. You're safe now. We need to get out of here." Sarah flinched at my touch as if startled from a trance. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and confusion, but she didn't move. I helped her to her feet, keeping my hand on her arm as a reassuring gesture. The shadows in the shack seemed to close in tighter, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. With Sarah leaning on me, we carefully made our way out of the shack. The cries had faded, leaving only the heavy silence behind us. As we stepped back into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking, hidden just out of sight. The forest was still, almost too still, and every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I guided Sarah through the trees, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every now and then I'd glance back, half expecting to see those shadowy figures following us. There was nothing, just the cold, unfeeling forest closing in around us. When we finally reached the clearing where my colleagues were waiting, the relief was almost overwhelming. The lights from their flashlights cut through the darkness, creating a warm, safe bubble amidst the cold, oppressive forest. Sarah collapsed into one of the ranger's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, and I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. As we led Sarah back to the base camp, couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. The forest seemed to breathe with a sense of satisfaction, as if it had achieved whatever it had set out to do. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those shadowy figures emerging from the trees, but there was nothing. Just the cold, dark forest stretching out behind us. In the days that followed, Sarah and I shared our story with the other rangers. They listened, nodding with understanding. It wasn't the first time they heard of strange occurrences in the forest. Over the years, there had been other missing hikers, unexplained phenomena, and eerie tales that seemed to fit with what Sarah had described. We pieced together the stories, trying to make sense of the patterns that emerged. The forest had its own way of reminding us of its mysteries. We learned to respect its boundaries, to listen to its warnings, and to always be on guard. Randolph Forest was more than just trees and wildlife. It was a place where the veil between the known and the unknown was thin, where the echoes of the past whispered through the branches. As I looked out over the forest now, I felt a new sense of reverence. It was a place of beauty, also of danger. Every rustle in the leaves, every shadow cast by the moonlight, held a story waiting to be told. A story of survival, fear, and the enduring power of nature's secret. The forest had taught me a valuable lesson, that sometimes the greatest threats come from the unseen, and we must always be cautious of the darkness that lies beyond the light. My name's Johnny, and I've been patrolling Randolph Forest longer than I can remember. Most days it's the usual, checking trails, guiding lost hikers, keeping an eye out for any trouble. But one night, everything changed. It was a chilly spring evening, kind where the air feels just a little too still. I was making my rounds when a distress call crackled through my radio. A group of campers had gone missing near Dead Man's Hollow, a place with a reputation that sends shivers down even the toughest ranger's spine. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my gear and headed out, my heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination. Dead Man's Hollow wasn't close, but I knew the trails like the back of my hand. As I walked, familiar sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, seemed to fade away. There was a heaviness in the air, an unnatural quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Twilight was fading fast, and the forest grew darker with every step. I could feel a change in the atmosphere, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something unseen was watching my every move, but I pressed on, my flashlight cutting through the growing darkness as I made my way towards the hollow. By the time I reached Dead Man's Hollow, the last light of day had disappeared, leaving me in near total darkness. Silence was deafening. Even the usual nighttime chorus of insects and animals had fallen silent, as if the whole forest was under some kind of spell. I scanned the area with my flashlight, looking for any sign of the campers. That's when I saw it. A flickering campfire in the distance, flames casting long, eerie shadows on the trees. My heart raced as I approached the fire, calling out to the missing group. But the only answer was the crackling of the flames. As I got closer, the campsite came into view, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The tents were torn apart, belongings scattered everywhere, like something or someone had ripped through the place in a frenzy. It was clear that whatever had happened here, it wasn't natural. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of the scene. The flickering fire cast wild shadows that danced on the trees, making everything feel even more surreal. My flashlight swept over the torn tents and scattered gear, but there was no sign of the campers. No blood, no bodies, just destruction, like they'd been ripped away in the middle of whatever they were doing. Then, I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. "Help us," it said, barely audible but unmistakably real. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, carried on the breeze like a ghostly echo. My pulse quickened and I spun around, trying to locate the source, but the whispering continued, seeming to seep out of the very trees around me. I called out again, louder this time, but the only response was that eerie whisper, growing more insistent, more desperate. "Help us." The word sent chills down my spine, and I knew I had to follow it, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. I pushed through the underbrush, my flashlight cutting a path through the darkness as I followed the voice deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around me, their branches scraping against my jacket like skeletal fingers trying to hold me back. The further I went, the more the atmosphere changed. The air felt thicker, heavy with something I couldn't quite name. Every step I took felt like I was walking into a trap. I couldn't stop. That whisper had a hold on me, pulling me forward. Finally, I reached the edge of a clearing, and there it was. A cave entrance, almost hidden beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient oak. The whispering grew louder, reverberating off the stone walls, filling the air with a haunting, almost melodic tone. My breath caught in my throat as I realized this was where the voice had been leading me all along. The darkness inside the cave was absolute, swallowing up the light from my flashlight. But I knew I had no choice. With a deep breath, I stepped into the mouth of the cave, whispering now all around me, urging me deeper into the unknown. The cave swallowed me whole, its walls cold and damp under my fingertips as I felt my way forward. My flashlight flickered, the beam bouncing off the jagged rocks and casting twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. Further I went, more the whispering intensified, filling my ears with that same pleading voice, "Help us." It echoed off the walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cave was alive, watching me, waiting. As I ventured deeper, I noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, their meanings lost to time. They were crude, almost primitive, yet there was something unsettlingly familiar about them. like I'd seen them in a nightmare once. Couldn't remember where. My pulse quickened, the oppressive darkness pressing in on me from all sides. Then, just as I was beginning to think the cave was endless, I spotted a faint glow up ahead. I crept closer, the whispering now a constant, maddening hum in my ears. The passageway opened up into a small chamber, and there, bathed in the soft, flickering light of candles, was a makeshift altar. My breath caught in my throat as I took in the scene. On the altar were personal items, photos, journals, a child's toy, all belonging to the missing camper. They were arranged with a precision that made my skin crawl, like someone or something had placed them there with purpose. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was something far more sinister. Fear surged through me, cold and sharp. This was a ritual, tribute to something ancient and malevolent. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to pull me closer to the altar. But I couldn't stay. I had to get out, had to escape whatever dark presence was lurking in the shadows. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, a sudden movement caught my eye. In the corner of the chamber, shadows shifted, coalescing into a figure. Figure that shouldn't have been there. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, as the figure slowly began to move toward me, its gaze never wavering. That was all I needed. Adrenaline shot through me, and I bolted, racing back through the cave, the whispers now a deafening roar in my ears. The darkness seemed to close in around me, the walls tightening as I stumbled and scraped my way out. I didn't stop until I was out of the cave, gasping for breath in the cool night air, sound of the whisper still ringing in my head. I burst out of that cave like a man possessed, gulping in the cool night air as if I'd been drowning. My legs felt weak, my heart still pounding so hard it hurt. The whispers were gone, but their echo lingered in my mind, a maddening reminder of what I'd just thought I'd seen. I stumbled through the underbrush, the forest closing in around me once more. But this time it wasn't the trees that unnerved me. It was the feeling that whatever had been in that cave wasn't done with me yet. My flashlight flickered as I made my way back to the campsite, its dim beam struggling to pierce the darkness. Every rustle, every shadow set my nerves on edge. The forest, once familiar and almost comforting in its quiet isolation, now felt hostile, as if the very ground I walked on was trying to pull me under. I kept moving, driven by a primal need to put as much distance between myself and that cave as possible. When I finally reached the campsite, my fellow rangers were already there, their faces etched with worry. They'd been searching for the missing campers too, combing the area while I was in the cave. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because the moment they spotted me, they bombarded me with questions. But I could barely speak, the words catching in my throat as the memory of that figure in the cave flashed through my mind. I managed to tell them what I'd found, or at least tried to. The altar, personal belongings, the symbols on the walls. But I left out the part about the figure, about the whispers. I wasn't even sure they'd believe me, and truthfully, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But something in my voice, in the way I must have looked, convinced them that this was more than just a simple search and rescue. We spread out, combing the area again. Deep down, I think we all knew it was futile. Whatever had happened to those campers, they weren't going to be found, not by us, not that night. The forest felt different now, as if it had swallowed them whole and wasn't about to give them back. After hours of searching, we regrouped at the site, exhausted and frustrated. Forest, usually so full of life at night, was eerily silent, as if holding its breath, waiting. I could still feel that presence, lingering just out of sight, watching us from the shadows. We packed up what we could of the campers' belongings, a heavy sense of defeat settling over us. As we prepared to head back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, lurking just beyond the reach of our flashlights. The other rangers didn't say much, but I could tell they felt it too. We walked in silence, the weight of the night pressing down on us, until we finally emerged from the forest, leaving Dead Man's Hollow behind. But even as we stepped out of the trees, I knew that part of me was still trapped in that cave. The whispers and the shadows. The days that followed felt like a blur. The missing campers, the cave, the whispers. It all haunted me, refusing to let go. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that cave, the darkness pressing in, air thick with that eerie voice. Help us. The memory gnawed at me, making sleep nearly impossible. The other rangers sensed something had changed in me, but I couldn't bring myself to talk about it. Not fully. We all knew the forest had its secrets, its dark corners where things happened that couldn't be explained. But what I encountered felt different, more malevolent, like the forest had woken up to something ancient and angry. We continued our patrols. There was an unspoken agreement to steer clear of Dead Man's Hollow. The story of the missing campers spread among us like wildfire, the details twisted and exaggerated with each retelling. Some said they were taken by wild animals, others whispered about old curses and vengeful spirit. But no one dared to go back and find out. One night a few weeks later, I was on a solo patrol, my route skirting the edges of the hollow. Air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the forest was alive with its usual sound. But beneath it all, there was a tension, a silence that lurked just out of earshot, waiting to pounce. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe some part of me needed to face it. But I found myself heading toward Dead Man's Hollow again. The trail felt different this time, as if the forest itself was reluctant to let me through. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches brushing against me like cold fingers, urging me to turn back. But I didn't. When I reached the edge of the hollow, I stopped, the memory of that night rushing back in vivid detail. The torn tents, flickering campfire, figure in the cave. I half expected to hear the whispers again, but the night was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Didn't go any further. I just stood there, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. The forest had its own rules, its own way of dealing with those who ventured too deep. As I turned to leave, a rustling in the underbrush caught my attention. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. But it was just a deer, its eyes glowing in the beam of my flashlight before it darted away into the night. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and started back down the trail. I never went back to Dead Man's Hollow after that. And I never told anyone the full story of what I saw, or thought I saw, in that cave. Some things are better left unsaid, buried deep in the shadows where they belong. Randolph Forest is still my beat, but I patrol it differently now. I respect its boundaries, its secrets, because I learned that night that there are places in this world where the line between reality and superstition blurs, where ancient forces lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to wake. When they do, best to leave them alone. My name is Mike, and I've been a ranger in Randolph Forest for over 2 decades. But it was the summer of 1998 that still haunts me, even after all these years. Back then, I was just a young guy, full of energy and eager to explore every inch of the forest. I loved my job, loved the solitude, and the way the forest seemed to come alive at dusk. I thought I knew everything there was to know about those woods, every trail, every hidden spot where the sun barely touched the ground. I was wrong. It was a Friday evening, right as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I was wrapping up a routine patrol when a call came through on the radio. A family, a husband, wife, and their young daughter, had gone missing. They'd gone out for a weekend camping trip in the western part of the forest, and hadn't returned as planned. Their friends were starting to worry, so they contacted us. I didn't waste any time. My partner Mark and I geared up and set out immediately. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, as we made our way deeper into the western sector. There was something about the air that night, heavy, like it was thick with more than just the usual humidity, the kind of air that clings to your skin and makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. We followed the trail the family had taken, passing familiar landmarks that, in the growing darkness, felt strange and unfamiliar. The towering pines seemed to close in around us, their branches whispering in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Something unseen was lurking just out of sight. As we pushed further into the forest, The light from our flashlights became our only guide. The night was settling in fast, and with it came a creeping sense of dread that I couldn't quite place. I looked over at Mark, and I could tell he felt it too, though neither of us said anything. We just kept moving, the silence between us filled with the unspoken fear that something was very, very wrong. Hours passed, and the deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to come alive with unseen eyes. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my heart racing. But we had a job to do, and I wasn't about to turn back, no matter how much my instincts screamed at me to get the hell out of there. We pushed on, our flashlights cutting through the darkness as we followed the trail deeper into the forest. The night had fully settled in now, wrapping everything in a thick blanket of shadows. The usual sounds of the woods, crickets chirping, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were oddly muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It must have been around midnight when we finally stumbled upon their campsite. It was tucked away in a small clearing, just off the main trail. At first glance, it looked normal enough. 3 tents arranged around a fire pit, with the faint glow of dying embers casting long, flickering shadows. But as we got closer, the eerie silence of the place hit me like a punch to the gut. No signs of life, no sounds of laughter or chatter that you'd expect from a family on a camping trip. We called out, our voices echoing off the trees, but the only response was the crackling of the embers and the distant rustle of leaves. The tents were still zipped up, and nothing appeared out of place at first. But there was something off. A tension in the air, like the forest was holding a secret it didn't want us to discover. Mark and I exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between us. We both felt it, the sense that we weren't alone, that something had happened here. Something bad. We split up, each of us taking a different tent to check for any signs of the family. I unzipped the first tent, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside there were sleeping bags, half-eaten snacks, and a couple of lanterns, but no sign of the family. It looked like they had just stepped out for a moment, but the eerie stillness told me otherwise. I checked the other tents. Same thing. Everything was there. The people were gone, like they had vanished into thin air. As I stepped back out into the clearing, Mark was standing by the fire pit, his face pale in the dim light. "There's no sign of them," said, his voice low and tense. I nodded, feeling the same unease settle in my gut. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it. Faint, distant cry that sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind. It was human, desperate, and full of fear. We both froze, straining to hear it again. It seemed to come from deeper in the forest, beyond the campsite, where the trees grew thicker and the shadows darker. Without a word, we grabbed our gear and headed toward the sound. Every step felt like it was taking us further away from safety, deeper into something we didn't understand. Cry echoed through the trees again, louder this time, leading us into the heart of the forest. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of dread and determination fueling each step. We were close now, cry growing louder, more desperate. It led us to a small clearing, barely visible through the dense foliage. And there, standing among the ancient trees, was an old, weather-beaten cabin. The wooden walls were gray with age, the windows boarded up, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Mark and I exchanged another glance, this one filled with the fear we couldn't hide anymore. Whatever was happening here, it was far from normal. But we had no choice. We had to go inside. The family was out there somewhere, and we were their only hope. Taking a deep breath, I reached for the door, and with a creak that echoed through the trees, we stepped into the darkness. The moment we stepped inside the cabin, I knew something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with the stench of decay, like the place had been sealed off from the world for years. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the beams of our flashlights, and the silence was almost deafening. No creaks of the floorboards, no distant sounds of the forest, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. We moved cautiously, our footsteps barely making a sound on the old, rotting wood. The cabin was small, just a few rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Furniture was ancient, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Chairs were tipped over, and a table in the corner looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It was like stepping into a forgotten time, place that had been left to rot and fester. Mark and I split up, trying to cover more ground. I could feel my pulse quickening as I moved through the narrow hallway, the walls closing in on me. I kept my flashlight aimed ahead, but the shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and dancing just out of sight. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out, but I couldn't leave, not without finding some clue about what happened to that family. I reached the first room and pushed the door open with a creak. Inside, it was even worse. The windows were boarded up, barely letting in any light, and the air was colder. The warmth of the world couldn't reach this far. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper, and there was a bed in the corner, its sheets tattered and gray with age. But what really caught my eye was the writing on the walls. Strange, cryptic symbols scrawled in what looked like dried blood. They didn't make any sense, like some kind of twisted, ancient language that didn't belong in this world. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed out of the room, my mind racing. I had seen some strange things in my time as a ranger, but nothing like this. It was like the cabin was alive, pulsing with some dark, malevolent energy, wanted us gone. As I stepped back into the hallway, I heard Mark call out from the other side of the cabin. His voice was shaky, filled with something I hadn't heard from him before. Fear. "Mike, you need to see this," he said, his words echoing through the empty halls. I made my way over to where he was, in what looked like the main living area of the cabin. The room was larger, with a fireplace at one end, but it was just as cold and uninviting as the rest of the place. Mark was standing by a small table in the center of the room, his flashlight trained on something lying on the floor. It was a teddy bear, old and worn, its fur matted and one of its button eyes missing. It looked out of place here, like it didn't belong in this nightmare of a cabin. That wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the way the bear was positioned, lying on its back, its arms spread out, as if it had been placed there deliberately. This is wrong," Mark muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Couldn't disagree. The bear looked like it had been left behind by the missing family. The way it was arranged sent chills down my spine. It was too precise, too deliberate, like someone or something had left it there as a warning. Before I could respond, a sudden noise cut through the silence. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It reverberated through the cabin, shaking the floorboards under our feet and sending a wave of terror crashing over me. I spun around, my flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing there. Just shadows, shifting and twisting like they had a life of their own. "We need to get out of here," I said, a voice tight with fear. Mark didn't argue. He just nodded, his face pale and eyes wide with the same terror that was clawing at my insides. We turned and bolted for the door, our footsteps pounding on the old wood as the growl followed us, growing louder, more insistent. Felt like the cabin was alive, like it was trying to trap us inside to keep us from leaving. But we didn't stop. We tore through the hallway, bursting out the front door and into the clearing, where the cold night air hit us like a slap to the face. We raced out of the cabin, stumbling into the clearing, and it was like the forest exhaled with us. The chilling howl that had echoed through the cabin followed us into the night, primal, inhuman sound that I could still feel vibrating in my bones. My flashlight swept the area wildly, searching for any sign of movement, but all I could see were the towering trees, their shadows long and menacing. Mark and I didn't stop running until we were back at the campsite, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The fire pit was cold and dark, embers long since extinguished. The tents stood as silent sentinels in the darkness, their once welcoming appearance now a grim reminder of the family's disappearance. We collapsed on the ground, trying to catch our breath. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I looked at Mark, who was just as shaken, his face flushed with a mix of fear and exhaustion. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, unable to find words. The growl, the symbols on the walls, the teddy bear, it all felt like a bad dream, something I couldn't quite grasp. "Yeah, I saw it," I managed to say. "We need to report this, get back to base camp and call for backup." Mark agreed, his eyes still darting around as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness at any moment. We made our way back to the base camp, our nerves on edge. Forest seemed to close in around us, the trees whispering secrets we couldn't understand. The shadows seemed to move with us, following us back to the safety of the camp. When we finally reached base camp, we were met with concerned faces. We relayed our findings, trying to explain the strange symbols, the growl, and the unsettling atmosphere of the cabin. Our colleagues listened, their expressions a mix of skepticism and concern. Forest was full of old stories and superstitions. But this was different. The search continued for weeks. We scoured every inch of Randolph Forest, following leads, checking every nook and cranny. We even returned to the cabin, but it was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. There were no signs of the missing family, no clues to their whereabouts, nothing but the unsettling feeling that something had been there and had been watching us all along. In the end, family was never found. Their disappearance became another of the forest's many mysteries, a haunting story whispered among the locals and fellow rangers. Each time I patrolled the forest after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin, and whatever was lurking in the shadows, was still out there, waiting, watching. I've seen things in my years as a ranger that I can't explain, but that night in 1998 was different. It changed me, made me question everything I thought I knew about the Randolph Forest holds secrets that defy explanation, and some of those secrets are better left undiscovered. Chilling truth is that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unwary soul to cross their path. It's been years since that night, but the memories still linger, as vivid as if they happened yesterday. Randolph Forest has always had a way of creeping into your dreams, but since then, it's taken on a different, darker edge. Every time I step into those woods, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that something ancient and malevolent is waiting just beyond the shadows. The search for the missing family was eventually called off. Their disappearance remains unsolved, a haunting reminder of the forest's dark side. As for the cabin, it was like it had never existed. No one else seemed to find it, and no one else reported seeing anything strange. It's as if the forest itself wanted to erase the memory of that night, hiding the truth from anyone who might come looking. Even now, when I patrol the trails and check the campsites, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the old cabin standing among the trees, or to hear that low, guttural growl echoing through the woods. It's a sound I'll never forget, primal noise that spoke of something far beyond human understanding. I've tried to rationalize what happened, to find a logical explanation for the symbols, the teddy bear, and the eerie presence in the cabin, but every attempt to explain it away only leads me to more questions. The forest seems to guard its secrets closely, revealing just enough to unsettle and terrify, but never enough to understand. The most unsettling part of it all is the feeling that something is still out there, in the depths of Randolph Forest. Some things should be left undisturbed, and the forest taught me that the hard way. It's a place where reality and superstition blur, where the echoes of the lost whisper through the trees, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon them. Whenever I walk those shadowy trails now, I carry with me a deep respect for the forest and its secret. It's a place where the line between the known and the unknown is razor thin, and where some mysteries are best left buried. The night in 1998 changed me in ways I can't fully explain, but it taught me that some parts of the world are better left unexplored. As I continue my patrols, I can't help but think of the family who vanished that summer. Their story remains a chilling reminder that Randolph Forest is a realm of shadows and whispers, where some stories end in darkness, and some mysteries are never meant to be solved. My name is David, and I've spent most of my life as a ranger in Randolph Forest. Back in the summer of 1986, I encountered something in those woods that still gives me chills. I was a young ranger back then, eager to prove myself. One evening, I got a call about a group of backpackers who had gone missing near the northern edge of the forest. They were experienced hikers, familiar with the trails, so their sudden disappearance was especially alarming. My colleague, Tom, and I set out at dawn to search for them. Forest was alive with the usual sounds, birds singing, leaves rustling. As we followed their planned route, our senses alert for any sign of them. As the sun began to set, we came across their campsite, a small clearing with a circle of tents. The air felt heavy, thick with an uneasy silence that made my skin prickle. Campsite was deserted, their belongings scattered as if they had left in a hurry. Tom and I exchanged worried glances, realizing that searching for them after dark would be nearly impossible. Yet there was an unsettling feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. We decided to wait until morning to resume our search, so we set up a makeshift camp nearby. The night felt unnaturally still, devoid of the usual nighttime sounds. I lay there, staring up at the stars, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. When dawn finally broke, we continued our search with renewed energy. We followed a faint trail deeper into the forest, our footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. The woods seemed to close in around us, and the trees seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't quite make out. Out of nowhere, a distant, mournful cry pierced the silence. It was faint but unmistakably human. Tom and I shared a look of grim understanding and quickened our pace, moving deeper into Randolph Forest, drawn to the source of the sound. Cry led us to a narrow, overgrown path we hadn't noticed before. It was hidden by thick underbrush, and pushing through it, branches snagging at our clothes, felt like we were venturing into the unknown. After what seemed like hours of battling the dense foliage, we finally stumbled into a small clearing. There, standing alone, was an ancient oak tree. Its gnarled branches reached up like skeletal fingers, and at its base we found a weathered stone slab covered in strange carvings. I approached the slab cautiously, running my fingers over the carvings. They depicted eerie scenes, figures dancing around a central figure, their faces twisted in expressions of agony and fear. A shiver ran down my spine, and an instinct told me that we should turn back. But curiosity pushed me forward. As I knelt to examine the markings more closely, a sudden gust of wind rustled the branches above, and for a fleeting moment, Forest felt like it was holding its breath. I felt a cold, unsettling presence that made my blood run cold. Tom's voice broke through my trance. He was pointing at something on the ground, a small leather-bound journal, half buried in the dirt. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and started flipping through the pages. Each entry seemed to drag me deeper into the growing sense of dread. The journal belonged to one of the missing backpackers. The entries spoke of unsettling experiences, whispers in the dark, shadowy figures darting between trees, and a growing feeling of being relentlessly hunted. As I read, it became clear that the forest was hiding something far darker than I had ever imagined. It was as if the very air around us had thickened with ancient, malevolent energy. I realized that the forest was not just a place of trees and trails. It was a realm where something old and sinister lay in wait. We took the journal back to base camp, but despite our efforts, the missing backpackers were never found. Their disappearance remains an unsettling mystery, a stark reminder of the forest's darker side. Years have passed since that summer of 1986, but the memory of that night still lingers. Chilling reminder of the forest's mystery. I've continued to patrol Randolph Forest, ever vigilant for signs of the unknown. The words from the journal echo in my mind, constant reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface. Forest holds secrets that defy explanation. It's a place where reality and myth intertwine, where ancient forces lie in wait for the next unsuspecting visitor. I've learned to respect its mysteries, to tread carefully among the shadows. I urge anyone who ventures into Randolph Forest to be cautious. Woods can be deceiving, and not everyone who enters emerges unscathed. Forest whispers its secrets, and some truths are best left undiscovered. The chilling truth is that the darkness within Randolph Forest patiently waits for its next chance to claim a new victim. My name is Robert, and I've spent over 30 years patrolling the trails of Randolph Forest. It's a place I know intimately, a place of breathtaking beauty, but also of hidden dangers. In the summer of 2005, something happened that shook me to my core and left a mystery that still haunts me. Back then, I was 58. Seasoned ranger who had learned to respect both the beauty and the perils of the forest. I'd seen my fair share of strange things over the years, but nothing prepared me for what was about to unfold. On a particularly humid afternoon, I got a distress call from a group of hunters who had ventured into the southeastern part of the forest and had gotten themselves lost. Their voices on the radio were filled with panic. They spoke of eerie noises and a feeling of being watched, something that sent chills down my spine. With my loyal dog Ranger at my side, I set out to find them. The forest was dense, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I knew time was running short. The distress call came in late afternoon, just as the day's heat was starting to wane. The hunters sounded frantic on the radio, their voices shaking with fear. They described strange noises and a creeping sense of being watched. Their words clipped and urgent. My stomach nodded at their tone. This wasn't just a case of getting lost. I grabbed my gear and called Ranger, my faithful companion. He was always alert, his sharp senses often picking up on things I couldn't. We set off towards the southeastern part of the forest, the dense foliage and humid air making our progress slow. The forest was thick with trees and underbrush, and as we pushed deeper into the woods, the daylight began to fade, casting everything in a dim, unsettling twilight. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant call of a bird. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. When we finally reached the coordinates I'd been given, I found the hunter's campsite abandoned. Tents were set up but empty, and their gear was scattered around, as if they had been interrupted in a hurry. My heart sank at the sight. Ranger was on high alert, his nose working furiously as he sniffed the ground. His body language told me something was very wrong. The eerie silence of the clearing was unsettling. I called out for the hunters, but my voice seemed to disappear into the vastness of the forest, swallowed by the growing darkness. With no sign of them, I felt a deep sense of unease settle over me. Ranger and I had to follow their trail, which now led us deeper into the forest where the shadows grew darker and the air felt colder. As night started to fall, the forest took on an entirely different character. The dimming light made everything look unfamiliar, and the once comforting rustle of leaves now seemed menacing. I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest as I examined the hunters' abandoned campsite. Tents lay empty, their flaps hanging loosely, and gear was strewn about as if the hunters had fled in panic. A half-eaten meal sat on a table, untouched. Ranger was on high alert, the ears pricked and his nose working overtime. He sniffed around the campsite, occasionally letting out a low whine, a sign that he sensed something out of the ordinary. I checked the area thoroughly, my flashlight sweeping over the scene, but there was no sign of the hunters or any immediate clues as to what might have happened. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, but there was an underlying scent of something else, something faint but unsettling. It was as if the forest itself was trying to tell me something. I called out for the hunters again, but my voice seemed to fade into the encroaching darkness, unanswered. We followed the trail deeper into the forest, pushing through increasingly dense underbrush. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the forest grew eerily silent. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, heightening the sense of foreboding that clung to us. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down, making the journey feel endless and unsettling. As the last light of day disappeared, the forest was swallowed by darkness. Ranger's growls and occasional whimpers were the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence. I kept moving, every step feeling heavier, as if the forest itself was resisting our progress. Just as night fully enveloped the forest, we stumbled upon an old hunting cabin nestled among towering oaks. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. The cabin's windows were boarded up, and the door hung ajar, creaking softly with the breeze. There was an odd energy around the place, a feeling that something was profoundly wrong. Ranger growled softly beside me, his fur bristling and his body tense. It was unusual for him to show such fear. He was usually the bravest of dogs. I took a deep breath and approached the cabin cautiously, my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. I pushed the door open wider, its creaking sound echoing unnervingly in the stillness. The interior was pitch black, the air thick with dust and a musty odor that made my skin crawl. I shone my flashlight around, revealing overturned furniture and scattered hunting gear, but no sign of the hunters. It was as though they had vanished into thin air. A sudden movement in the corner of the room caught my eye. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just that heavy darkness that seemed to press in on us. Ranger's whine grew louder, and he pressed closer to me, clearly distressed. Then came the growl, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the cabin. It felt like it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Primal noise that froze me in place. The darkness seemed to shift, the shadows moving and swirling into shapes that were almost recognizable, not quite. I backed toward the door, every instinct telling me to run, but I couldn't tear myself away. The growls grew louder, merging with whispers that seemed to seep from the walls. The language was foreign, incomprehensible, and chilling. It filled the air with a sense of dread that I could almost touch. Desperation set in as I tried to call out to the hunters again, my voice quivering with fear and urgency. The only response was the relentless growling and whispering that seemed to close in around me. Ranger's barking turned frantic, a desperate sound that matched the growing terror in my chest. The growls and whispers grew louder, their intensity almost suffocating. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, its dark corners filled with unseen eyes watching. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely think over the cacophony of unsettling sounds that surrounded us. Ranger, usually so brave, was now trembling beside me. His fierce barking was the only thing cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. His courage seemed to pull me out of my paralysis, and I knew we had to get out of there before it was too late. I grabbed his collar, trying to steady my shaking hands as I steered him toward the door. As we burst out of the cabin, the cold night air hit us like a splash of water. We sprinted through the underbrush, branches scratching at our faces and the undergrowth tangling around our legs. The growls and whispers faded behind us. Fear didn't leave. Forest seemed to close in, the darkness pressing in as if trying to pull us back. We ran until we reached the clearing where my colleagues were waiting, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Panting and disheveled, we collapsed in the safety of the light. Ranger's whimpering slowly subsided as he calmed down, but the terror in his eyes mirrored my own. The hunters were never found. The forest had swallowed them up, leaving behind only questions and fear. I'll never forget that night, the sounds, the shadows, and the feeling of being hunted by something beyond understanding. Even now, as I patrol these woods, I can't shake the memory of that cabin and the sinister presence that seemed to lurk within. Randolph Forest holds its secrets tightly, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The haunting echoes of that night serve as a chilling reminder of the dangers that lie hidden in the depths of the forest. My name is Greg, and for nearly 2 decades, I've patrolled Randolph Forest, a place that holds both beauty and secrets beyond explanation. In the summer of 1994, an experience in these woods changed my life forever. I was 48 at the time, a seasoned ranger well acquainted with every trail and clearing. One warm evening, I received a distress call that set my nerves on edge. A family of 4 had gone missing while camping near the southern edge of the forest. They were seasoned outdoors enthusiasts, so their sudden disappearance was all the more puzzling. The urgency in the caller's voice was unmistakable, a stark contrast to the usual calm of the forest. With my partner Emily by my side, we prepared to head out at first light. Forest, with its familiar sights and sounds, suddenly felt different, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for us to unravel its latest mystery. Emily and I set out early the next morning, our hearts heavy with the weight of the missing family's predicament. The forest was alive with the morning symphony of birds and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. We followed their intended route, our eyes scanning every inch for any sign of their presence. As we neared their campsite, Forest's usual tranquility felt charged with an underlying tension. Campsite was neat, with tents set up and a campfire still smoldering. It was as if the family had just left, but there was no one around. The absence of the family felt like a void in the forest's fabric. I called out their names, but the forest swallowed my voice. The silence that answered was unnerving, amplifying the growing unease that had settled over us. Emily and I searched the area thoroughly, our senses on high alert. The forest seemed vast and indifferent, hiding whatever had become of the family. As dusk began to settle over the forest, Emily and I stumbled upon a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. It was an old logging path, almost completely overgrown, and something about it seemed off. Despite the growing darkness and a gnawing sense of unease, we decided to follow it, hoping it might lead us to the missing family. The trail wound through dense thickets and crossed babbling brooks, the fading light casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the forest floor. With each step, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the forest itself was closing in around us. The once familiar woods now seemed foreboding, their silence more oppressive than calming. Ranger, my loyal dog, was on high alert, his nose twitching and ears perked up. Even Emily, usually so composed, was visibly tense. We pressed on, driven by both duty and an increasing sense of dread. The deeper we went, the more isolated we felt, as if we were moving further away from the safety of the known and into something unknown and unsettling. Just when we were about to turn back, a sound broke through the stillness. Child's laughter, clear and joyous, echoing through the trees. My heart leaped with hope, and we quickened our pace, desperate to find the source. The laughter seemed to lead us deeper into the heart of the forest. Eventually, we arrived at a small clearing bathed in the soft glow of twilight. At its center stood an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Around the base of the tree was a circle of wildflowers, their petals glistening with dew. But despite the enchanting scene, there was no sign of the family. The clearing was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. The absence of the family in such a seemingly serene place added to the growing unease that clung to us. As Emily and I stood there, bewildered and searching, a sudden chill swept through the clearing. The temperature dropped abruptly and a dense fog began to roll in, enveloping the area in an unsettling, ghostly silence. A bone-chilling fog rolled in, wrapping the clearing in an eerie silence. The temperature plummeted, and Emily's breath misted in the cold air. I felt a shiver run down my spine as the fog grew thicker, obscuring our surroundings and heightening the sense of isolation. Emily grabbed my arm, her voice barely a whisper as she pointed toward the oak tree. There, etched into the ancient bark, were strange symbols glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. They seemed to pulse gently, their meaning eluding me, their presence undeniably unsettling. A sense of profound dread settled over me as I realized we had stumbled upon something far beyond our understanding. The symbols in the fog felt otherworldly, as if the forest was revealing a hidden layer of its nature. Just as we were about to retreat, a soft, incomprehensible voice whispered from the shadows, a sound that seemed to come from the very trees themselves. The language was foreign, and though I couldn't understand the words, tone conveyed a clear message, a warning perhaps, or a lament. Time seemed to freeze. Forest seemed to hold its breath, and Emily and I exchanged a silent, fearful glance. Fog lifted as abruptly as it had come, glowing symbols fading into ordinary bark. The clearing returned to its previous state, but the eerie stillness remained. We searched for hours and days, but the family was never found. Their disappearance remains an unsolved mystery, a chilling reminder of the secrets Randolph Forest keeps hidden. To this day, as I patrol these woods, the memory of that evening lingers, a haunting testament to the forest's dark and enigmatic nature. My name is Jack, and I've spent decades patrolling Randolph Forest. But the events of the summer of 2008 are etched in my memory like a dark stain. I was 42 at the time, an experienced ranger accustomed to the forest's many moods. On a warm July evening, a distress call came through that made my heart sink. A young girl named Emily, just 8 years old, had gone missing from her family's campsite deep in the heart of Randolph Forest. I grabbed my gear and met up with my partner Sarah. The forest was alive with the usual sounds, chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. We headed out at first light, following the frantic cries of Emily's parents, Mary and John. The urgency in their voices told us this was serious. I couldn't shake the growing dread in my chest as we made our way into the woods. As we approached the campsite, the atmosphere shifted. An oppressive stillness settled over the clearing, the usual sounds of the forest fading into an uneasy quiet. The tents stood empty, their flaps fluttering weakly in the breeze. The campfire was nothing more than a pile of smoldering ashes, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Mary and John were visibly distraught. They told us Emily had gone off to pick wildflowers just before dusk, and despite their frantic search, she had disappeared. Their worry was palpable, and it only deepened the pit in my stomach. Sarah and I began our search around the campsite, calling out Emily's name until our voices were hoarse. The forest seemed to swallow our words, returning only silence and the occasional rustle from the underbrush. As twilight began to settle, I noticed a narrow trail partially obscured by dense undergrowth. It looked like an old logging path, barely visible beneath the thick foliage. We exchanged a glance, knowing we had to follow it if we wanted to find any clue about Emily's whereabouts. The forest around us felt increasingly suffocating, the shadows growing longer and more twisted with each step. We ventured down the trail, our flashlights slicing through the encroaching darkness. Strange noises seemed to echo from every direction, whispers that felt like they were coming from the very shadows themselves. Forest seemed to be holding its breath, and with every crackling twig beneath our feet, the sense of dread only deepened. Sarah and I pushed forward, driven by a mix of apprehension and determination. Suddenly, Sarah froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Ahead, bathed in the cold light of the moon, was a small clearing. My heart skipped a beat when I saw Emily's teddy bear lying on the ground, abandoned among the wildflowers. Its button eyes seemed to stare directly at us, an unsettling reminder of the missing girl. I scanned the clearing, searching desperately for any sign of Emily. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if the forest itself was pressing in around us. The silence was punctuated only by the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. Then, a child's laughter pierced the night, clear and joyous, yet completely out of place in the stillness of the forest. The sound seemed to come from all directions, teasing and elusive. Sarah grabbed my arm, her face pale as she pointed towards the edge of the clearing. There, amidst the trees, stood a shadowy figure that swayed gently as if caught in an unseen breeze. We approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. But as we got closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of laughter that slowly faded away. Emily was nowhere to be found, and the forest fell silent once more, stubbornly guarding its secret. Exhausted and bewildered, Sarah and I returned to the campsite where Mary and John were waiting anxiously. We recounted what we had seen, but the strange events of that night defied explanation. Emily's disappearance remained a haunting mystery, seemed to elude all understanding. In the days that followed, we conducted extensive searches, scouring every inch of the forest. Despite our efforts, Emily was never found. Her disappearance became a chilling tale among rangers, a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of the forest and the secrets it keeps hidden within its ancient depths. To this day, as I patrol Randolph Forest, I carry with me the memory of that fateful night in 2008. The laughter in the darkness continues to haunt my dreams, a testament to the enduring mystery of Emily's disappearance. The forest remains a place of beauty and wonder, but also of shadows and uncertainty. It's a place where reality and myth blur, where the echoes of the past linger in every shadow, a chilling truth that haunts me every time I step beneath its ancient canopy.